Welcome. This is a continuation of my series around navigating complexity. In the last couple of videos, I was talking about polarity thinking and systems thinking or systems theory or complexity theory as different ways that can help us navigate the issues that we're in. But let me do a recap right here, because in a moment, I'm going to talk about how we can apply some of the lessons that we can learn about managing complex systems or managing interdependent polarities. We'll start with just remembering that the system right now is benefiting from us being divided, whether that's the media or lobbyists or politicians or political parties. They're getting a lot out of highlighting the extremes and organizing our choices into yes and no, for, against, us or them. And this is undermining our capacity for decision making. In a certain way, we're not really, at least our government and our political system is unable to make decisions around serious political issues. They're offering us false choices. They're missing the complexity and the nuance of the issues, and they're giving us the illusion of conclusion. The idea that we're going to somehow get to the end of all of this. And so my thinking in the Omni-Win project here is that the world of polarity thinking and systems theory can offer a lot to us. So if you want to learn more about that, check out the other videos. But right now, I'll just say that some of the things that come forward by looking at the world with a recognition of complexity and interdependent polarities, there's a couple themes that come up, and then I'm going to talk about how we can manage them. So one of those themes is the idea of emergence. Just as two sides of an interdependent polarity are actually part of a bigger system, we're not choosing one or the other, there's something larger in that both and, a greater whole, a greater question that is the piece, but we tend to just focus on this and that. Or in a complex system where there's tons of different actors and agents, like a country or an organization or an ecosystem, something bigger happens with the creation of the forest or the nation or the organization, and that thing is different than the smaller parts. So that's the idea of emergence. Another concept that comes out of systems thinking and polarity thinking is the idea of interdependence. The different parts, the different ideas, the different concepts, the different actors, the different actions, all are interacting with each other. They're influencing each other. And all the different pieces are relevant. As Tom Atlee points out, there's the idea of universal participation. Everyone's participating. Even if they're not participating, they're still participating in their non-participation. So we're all interdependent, interconnected. We cannot separate ourselves. Another lesson that comes forward is that these systems are dynamic. They're constantly in a state of change. There's nothing static about a complex system. And part of that is that there's a sensitivity to the initial conditions, like how we started. There's a sensitivity to the context around it. So even if the United States as a complex system was just by itself, the actions of Canada or Mexico or Ukraine, Russia, China, all of those are impacting the system. So the systems are open, and all of these other variables, both the deep history, the actions in the moment, and the external things, are all impacting this system. And similarly, or consequently, I guess, these are unpredictable. There's an uncertainty about what's going to happen. That is unclear about how things will just play out left alone, but also any action that we take is going to have an unpredictable or uncertain outcome because it's dynamic, interdependent, emergent, and sensitive to conditions. How do we manage all of this? So I'm going to share some ideas around managing, leading, navigating complexity that come from a variety of different sources. Some of these are from articles from the Harvard Business Review. Some are from Human Systems Dynamic Institute. And some of them are from videos by an organization called Systems Innovation that has some really great complexity management videos. All of those links are down below, so go ahead and check them out. So let me tell you just some ideas on how we can deal with some of these 5 or so elements of interdependent, complex systems. So how do we deal with this idea of emergence, or what lesson do we get from it? First of all, with emergence, there comes a great lesson that we cannot assume that understanding all the different parts of a system is actually going to help us understand the system as a whole, not how it operates. So using the examples from before, we can't take one American or any single human American and get a sense of what the United States is from talking to that person, just as we can't do that from a human and try to understand what a city is, or we can't really understand a forest for the trees, as they say. So that also means that we can't put the blame on any single individual. We can't say that person changes, everything's going to be fixed. We also can't say that if this person changes, everything will be solved. No individual is responsible for the solution either. And part of what this points to is that the whole is not just all the pieces that are in it, but it's also the relationships in between the parts of the whole. And so when we're looking at emergence and looking at any kind of emergent system, we need to recognize that the quality of the connections is one of the most important places to be doing our work. This points to, like, again, how do we understand interdependence? And part of that is just taking a holistic perspective. And what I mean by that here is we need to understand the parts of the system, and we need to understand the whole of the system and recognize those as 2 different things. Another thing we can do, a strategy for managing any kind of complex system, is to focus on the relationships. If we can improve the quality of the relationships, the interactions, the communication, the connections between all the different parts of any given system, then the whole system will improve as well. So instead of focusing on the individuals, focusing on the lines in between the individuals is a really powerful way of using a systems understanding to help us manage complexity. And as we're thinking about that and focusing on those relationships, it's also worth taking into account all the different variables, all the different voices. It's really helpful if we're dealing with a complex system to have diversity of thought. That is really important because the more perspectives we can have looking at any given issue, or the more parts of a system we can engage as we're trying to figure out how to change it or move it forward, the better situation we're going to have. One of the biggest risks that you can take is excluding someone who has a key piece of information. Make sure there's diversity of thought, improve the quality of the relationships, and both pay attention to the parts of the whole and the connections in between. Now, even if we do all of that, we still are in a dynamic system that is changing and is going to be constantly in flux. So the first lesson from that is let go of the conclusion illusion. Don't hope that we're going to get to a fixed solution or a fixed outcome. Instead, we have to take in the idea that we have to keep on adapting. And that means we got to spend less energy on resistance and more energy on creative adaptation. If you don't like something, how can you work with it and grow with it and change it, as opposed to just trying to stop it? Really important to remember that conclusion illusion is that a fixed solution is going to be destructive or degenerative in an interdependent polarity or a complex system. Trying to get something to stay and stop changing that effort is actually not going to work out. How do we deal with all these different pieces? If we can't find the answer or we're not going to find a fixed solution, what do we do? One of the ideas here is to use simple, common operating principles or guiding principles. And Another way to think about this is like an algorithm. A complex system means that all the different agents or all the different parts of the system are all acting in a certain way of thinking, and they're all responding to things in certain ways. Everyone has in their mind a certain operating principles. But if we can change what those operating principles are, then we can change the way the dynamic system will start moving. And the Human System Dynamics Institute has a set of simple rules for creating simple rules. So if you're going to make rules for a system to sort of guide the way that it works and operates, first of all, try to influence behaviors that are creating a pattern. So if a certain behavior is creating a certain pattern, try to make a rule that changes that behavior, because that will change a bigger pattern. Don't make too many rules, so like fewer than 8, a small handful of rules so that everyone can remember, this is what I'm supposed to do in this situation. This is how I'm supposed to respond. Other ideas that you start with a verb or make it action based. And also make sure that everyone agrees to the rules. You can't have people operating with a set of rules that don't work for everyone in every situation. So they have to be simple. And always make sure that they're positive. An example of this rule is a guiding principle that Tom Atlee, who is a upcoming guest on the podcast, he has a prime directive of wise democracy, and that is to engage, enact, and elevate the wisdom of the group in service of the whole group, and try to be as inclusive as possible. How do we make sure that we're including all the wisdom, or how do we make sure that we're trying to find the most wise choices? That kind of thinking is going to be the stuff that'll help the complex system operate a little better. We have a system that's always changing, and as I said before, it's sensitive to these initial conditions. So every change is going to have an impact on it. And every change that's outside of the system will also impact the system. Just remember that the context matters, the conditions matter. So know where you are, know what's going on around you. Expand your research, your scope of information. Who else is involved in this? What else is relevant? An example of this, if you're working on some healthcare system and you're trying to change something, like, do you take into account the food vendors who sell the food to the hospitals? Like, that might not be something you'd think about when you brought it together, all the doctors and the patients. So what are all the pieces that are happening around a system that might impact it? And part of this also then is just letting go of the outcome. Doing things, trying them out, and then seeing what happens. And so this leads to the idea of just anticipating unpredictability. Predict unpredictability in a way. And that means you can't be arrogant or certain about what's going to happen. So whenever possible, again, this is from Human Systems Dynamics Institute, turn your judgments into curiosities. I do this all the time. If I start feeling judgment, I'm like, oh, I probably should be curious now. Another thing is take your conflict. If there's a conflict, use it as a chance for exploration. If you run into defensiveness, try to figure out how it can be a chance for self-reflection. And if you have assumptions about something, actually name those assumptions and turn them into questions. And then another great way to navigate unpredictability is experiment. Try prototypes and try an example of something and see if it works out, and continuously make adjustments. You got to keep trying. You can't stop, because stopping or thinking that you're going to just solve the issue or whatever, that is close to that problem with the fixed solutions. So you got to keep trying. And a way to think about this is the idea of praxis. I think about praxis as sort of action, reflection, cycle. You do something and then you reflect on what happened, and then you do something else. The human systems dynamics folks have what they call adaptive action. And that's to say what's happening, what are the patterns we can see, try to understand why are these patterns happening or what is the impact of them, and then now what? So what So what? Now what? And that's a cycle, because then you're going to act with courage, and then you're going to create an outcome, and then see what happens, and then reflect to understand it, and then act again. So that process is there. And then the last piece I'll say about unpredictability is we got to understand that risk is real, and we got to have better risk mitigation techniques. So as we're looking to see what's going to happen, and we realize we don't have certainty what the outcome of our action is going to be, because it's a complex system, plan for a range of outcomes. Like, what is the best case scenario and what is the worst case scenario? And if the worst case scenario happens, how can we make sure that we're ready for that? Or if this goes this way, or if it goes that way, like what would happen? Thinking about a set of different responses to an outcome, or how the system responds to you, can be really helpful. But making sure that if you take an action, you don't know what's going to happen, making sure that you haven't put all your eggs into that basket. Last little piece here before going on to the next part here is that there are patterns in complex systems. That's one of the cool things about them. In the complexity science, they're called strange attractors. But the point is that there's all sorts of patterns in these systems, and recognizing them and being curious about them can be really helpful. And one of the patterns is that there's interdependent polarities. So a lot of those chronic tensions and ongoing conflicts are going to be happening because there's an interdependent polarity. Some of the most classics are around like what's good for me, what's good for the group, what's good for my group versus the other group, versus how do I deal with the past and how do I deal with the future. And in each of those, it's important to pay attention to elevating like what is good about each side of the polarity, and to try to mitigate what's harmful. But again, back to the beginning, remembering that the both and, if you can get both sides of polarity to be working well, then you're going to have something that's generative. If you try to choose one side of the polarity, or choose one action at the expense of other ones, then it'll become a destructive system. So that's a lot. So I'll just end right now when it comes to managing complexity. And again, check out all the articles that I've linked below, that this is all part of the creative process. We are in a creative process. The universe is a creative process. We will always be in dynamic tension, and we're always going to have unclear solutions and unclear outcomes and an uncertain future. But that also means that we have infinite possibility. And this is where the creative process comes in. How can we take in all the variables, the parts and the whole, and the relationships, and all the different kinds of solutions and actors and perspectives, and how can we come up with solutions that are creative, that are trying to be generative, that are trying to be inclusive, and recognizing our interdependence, and reducing our sense of certainty or arrogance. So there is a lot here, and this will be a topic that will continue to come up throughout the Omni-Win project. But if you want to learn more about this managing complexity stuff, check out the articles below. And if you're interested in actually learning about complexity theory, or complexity science, or chaos, or systems dynamics, all of that, I highly recommend the Santa Fe Institute. The Santa Fe Institute is an institution that's dedicated to working on complexity thinking. It's multidisciplinary. And they have a school online called the Complexity Explorer. I just really want to recommend that because there's a lot of different courses there. They have ones about fractals and biology and the origins of life, introductions to dynamic systems and chaos. All of those are possible. I highly recommend the Santa Fe Institute. Check it out. Those are some of the courses that I took many years ago to help me become what I am. But understanding complex systems is an essential part of being able to navigate them. So go check it out. Coming next, I'm going to be talking a bit about polarity thinking and some of the applications in the world of democracy and politics that I find to be particularly interesting. Thank you so much for listening, and have a great day.